There is a door on the ground floor of Windsor Castle that the guidebooks do not mention. It has no number, no plaque, nothing to tell a paying visitor it is even a door at all, because for most of the year it is disguised as a stretch of panelling, indistinguishable from the wall around it. You have been told, in a voice that does not invite questions, to dust the panel and move on. You're about to find out why, not because anyone wants you to, because on one afternoon in the autumn of 1844 a swollen, paint-fused door comes open a few hours before it is supposed to, and you are standing close enough to see what is behind it before anyone can stop you. That afternoon is coming. Hold on to it. First you need to live through everything that gets you there. Windsor in the 1840s is two castles wearing one stone skin. There is the castle the public buys a ticket to see, the state apartments with their gilt ceilings and their portraits of dead kings, walked through in respectful little groups by visitors who have paid their shilling and put on their good coats for the occasion. And there is the other castle, the one underneath and behind and beside that one, where several hundred people cook and scrub and carry and empty and polish, from 4 in the morning until long after the last lamp in the round tower goes dark, so the first castle can go on looking the way it looks. You live in the second castle. You have lived there since you were 13. By the time this night is over, you will know things about the first castle that nobody who buys a ticket is ever supposed to learn. You arrive in January of 1841, 4 days into the new year, with a canvas bag holding 2 shifts, a comb, and a letter of character from the vicar's wife in Windsor town, who has known your mother since they were girls together. Your mother is dead 8 months by then, of a fever that took half the lane with her, and your father works the timber yard down by the river when there is timber to be had, which this winter there mostly is not. When the housekeeper who oversees the under-housemaids of the state apartment sends word that she needs another pair of young hands who won't faint at a dead grate or a chamber pot, your father walks you up the hill himself, holding your bag because your hands are shaking too badly to hold it steady, and leaves you at the servants' entrance without much more than a nod, because that is the kind of man he is, and because if he says anything more he might not be able to make himself leave at all. The gate you go in through is not the gate the visitors use. Visitors come through Henry VIII's gate, under the arch, into the lower ward, where they can look up at the round tower and feel appropriately small. You go in through a low door near the kitchen court that smells, even in the freezing air, of boiled mutton fat and coal smoke and something sourer underneath, that you will later learn is the drains, which back up more often than anybody upstairs would like to admit. Mrs. Prewitt, the housekeeper, meets you just inside, a broad woman with forearms like a washerwoman's despite 30 years of never touching a washtub, and looks you up and down the way you'd look at a heifer at market. You're small for 14. I'm big enough to work, ma'am. Her mouth does something that isn't quite a smile. We'll see. Everyone says that on the first day. She's not wrong to be sceptical. Windsor Castle in the 1840s employs, by the reckoning of the people who keep such reckonings, close to 1,000 souls, from the Lord Chamberlain's clerks down to the boy who blacks the boots, and most of that 1,000 are servants of one grade or another, and most of the servants who start young do not last. The work eats them. You do not know that yet. What you know, standing in the freezing passage with your bag clutched to your chest, is that your hands are already cold enough to ache, and that somewhere above you, through several floors of stone you've not yet learned to navigate, there are rooms with ceilings painted gold, and you're expected to help keep them that way. Your first task, before you've even been shown where you are to sleep, is the grates. Every grate in the state apartments open to public viewing has to be blacked and laid fresh before the doors open at 11, and this particular January morning the girl who usually does the green drawing room has come down with a chest cough that has her doubled over, so you're handed a tin of blacking, a stiff brush and a rag, and pointed toward a room grander than any building you have ever stood inside in your life. The grate itself does not care how grand the room is. It is iron and cold and choked with yesterday's ash, and it wants raking out before anything else can happen to it. You kneel on the hearthstone. Someone has at least laid a square of old sacking down first, for which you are grateful, because the marble underneath would take the skin off your knees inside a minute, and work the little rake through the cold cinders, feeling for the clinkers, the hard lumps of unburned coal that have to come out, or the new fire will not draw properly. Ash gets into everything. It gets under your fingernails and into the creases of your knuckles and up into your nose, so you're sneezing black for the rest of the morning. When the grate is finally clear, you mix the blacking, a paste that smells of turpentine and something oilier underneath, sharp enough to make your eyes water in the enclosed room, and work it into the iron with the brush in long, even strokes, the way the cough-ridden girl showed you in about 90 seconds before being sent off to bed. Your arm aches before you're halfway round the grate. Not the ordinary tiredness of a morning's work, but a deep, specific ache in the muscle just below the shoulder, the one that does the brushing, over and over, the same motion 1,000 times, until the motion itself becomes a kind of pain independent of anything else. By the time you have buffed the blacking to the dull shine Mrs. Pruitt expects, you polish it, apparently, until it stops looking wet and starts looking like something that was always black, a distinction you do not yet understand but will, within a week, be able to judge at a glance. Your knuckles are scraped raw where the brush handle has worked against them, and there is a smear of blacking across your cheek that you do not discover until you catch your own reflection, hours later, in the dark glass of a window. You look up once at the ceiling of the room you're kneeling in. It is worth looking at. Gilded plasterwork, garlands and shields, a painted panel overhead showing some allegorical scene you have no names for. Gods, probably, or virtues, done up as women in robes that would scandalise the vicar. The chandelier above you, unlit at this hour, throws back 100 small distorted versions of the pale window light. You have never in your life been in a room this beautiful, and you're on your knees in it with black paste under your fingernails, and the two facts sit strangely together, and they will keep sitting strangely together for years. "Don't gawp," says a voice behind you. "Gawping doesn't get the next grate done." That is Susan Yarrow, the senior housemaid you will spend most of the next 4 years working under. A wiry woman of perhaps 25 with a face permanently set to an expression of mild, weary patience, as if she has been mildly, wearily patient with every new girl since the beginning of time, and expects to go on being so until the end of it. Susan is not unkind. She is simply 30 grates ahead of you in her own mourning, and has learned that sympathy, however genuinely felt, does not black an iron surface any faster. It's beautiful, you say, because it is the only word that comes. "It's a room," Susan says. "A very expensive room that somebody has to clean. Get up. Green drawing room's not the last one on your list this morning. By the time the state apartments open their doors to the public at 11 o'clock, you have done 3 grates, swept 2 hearths, and helped Susan roll and unroll the drugget, the coarse protective cloth laid over the good carpets when the family is not expected, taken up again before visitors arrive so the rooms look as they are supposed to look, undisturbed, permanently magnificent, as if no one ever walks on these floors at all except kings. That is the first thing you learn about Windsor Castle, and it is the thing that will matter most later, when the door in the unused corridor comes open. Everything the visitors see has been arranged for them to see it. Every room on the public route has been swept, dusted, polished and set in order by people, who then disappear through a service door moments before the public route opens. So the paying visitor, moving reverently from the grand reception room to the Waterloo Chamber to St. George's Hall, sees only the castle, gleaming and empty and eternal, and never once sees the small army of aching hands that made it look that way. You learn the shape of the household itself before you've learned much else, because a girl who does not learn it quickly finds herself in trouble within the first week. The servants' hall at Windsor is its own small kingdom, with its own laws of precedence as rigid, in their way, as anything observed upstairs among dukes and earls. At the long scrubbed table where the indoor staff take their meals, nobody sits where they like. The upper servants, the housekeeper, the steward's room staff, the head cook, the Queen's own dressers, none of whom you will exchange more than a dozen words with in your first year, eat separately in the steward's room, off better plates, with a decanter of wine that never once makes its way down to the long table where you sit. Below them come the footmen and the senior housemaids, then the under-housemaids like you, then the scullery girls and the hall boys, right down to the youngest kitchen skivvy, a girl of 11 named Peg, who has the job, among other things, of turning the spit before the new ranges are put in, standing so close to the fire so many hours a day that her face is permanently flushed a dull, scalded pink even on the coldest mornings. Your first meal in that hall, on the evening of your arrival, is bread and dripping and a mug of small beer, taken standing up at first because nobody thinks to tell you which bench is yours until Susan Yarrow, not yet your particular charge but already, evidently, unable to watch a new girl flounder without intervening, jerks a thumb at an empty space near the bottom of the table. There, and mind you don't take Peg's spot by the fire, she'll have your ears for it. The bread is coarse, and the dripping has gone slightly rancid at the edges of the crock, the way dripping does after a few days uncovered, but you eat every scrap of it, because the walk up from the town and the fright of the day have hollowed you out more than you realised until the food is in front of you. Around you, the hall is full of noise, 40 or 50 voices at once, footmen arguing about a horse race, 2 housemaids trading gossip about a lady's maid seen crying in the linen room, an old porter laughing so hard at his own joke he has to be thumped on the back by his neighbour. It is nothing at all like the hush of the state apartments 2 floors above, where a raised voice would be unthinkable, and you understand, without anyone explaining it to you, that this noise is itself a kind of relief valve. The pressure of a day spent moving silently and invisibly through rooms not your own, finally allowed to escape once the green baize door swings shut behind the last of you. You learn over the following weeks the particular etiquette of who may speak first to whom, which under footman fancies which under housemaid and is universally teased about it, which of the senior staff must be addressed as Mr. or Mrs., regardless of whether they hold any actual authority over you, and which of the younger ones, Susan among them, can simply be called by their Christian names, once you have proved yourself steady enough to be trusted with the familiarity. You learn that the bells that summon servants from the family's rooms hang in a long row, in a passage near the steward's room, each labelled, each with its own jangling note, and that a housemaid worth her wages can tell, from 2 rooms away, which bell is ringing and roughly how urgently, the way a mother is said to know her own infant's cry from any other, in a crowded room. Mrs. Prewitt herself gives you the closest thing to a formal lesson in your first month, cornering you one evening in the linen room after you have folded a stack of pillowcases in a manner she judges silently unsatisfactory, and unfolding every one of them again herself, slowly, deliberately, while you watch. "You'll think this is a small thing," she says, not looking up from her work. "Folding a pillowcase proper, and it is a small thing in itself. But this castle is built entirely of small things done proper, one on top of the last, thousands of them, every day. And the moment enough of them are done improper, the whole grand show starts to look shabby. And once it looks shabby, girl, people stop believing in it. And a castle that people stop believing in isn't worth the stone it's built from. Yes, ma'am. Fold it again. You fold it again, watching her blunt fingers correct the crease with two small precise movements, and you understand, in that unglamorous moment over a stack of linen, something that will hold true for every year of your service to come, that the grandeur upstairs and the diligence downstairs are not two separate things at all, but the same single thing, viewed from opposite ends of the same long chain of hands. And you learn the exhaustion. It is not the exhaustion of any single hard task. You could bear a single hard task, the way anyone can bear a single blow. It is the exhaustion of accumulation, of one task laid directly on top of the last, without any seam between them, from before first light until the household is finally permitted its own narrow hour of rest. By the end of your first week you have learned to sleep the moment your head meets the thin pillow, mid-thought sometimes, a sentence simply stopping in your mind as sleep takes it, and to wake at 4:30 with your body already half in motion, before your eyes are properly open, because that is what the work demands, and the work does not much care whether a 14-year-old girl is ready for it or not. By 11:30, the first group of the day is being walked through by one of the castle guides, a retired equerry named Mr. Hollis, who has done this work so long he could recite the history of every painting in his sleep, and probably does. You're sent up with a basket of fresh candles for the sconces in a room the group has not yet reached, and get your first close look at what a visitor actually is. There are perhaps 15 of them this morning. A clergyman and his wife, both craning their necks at the ceiling with an expression of frank astonishment that makes you, despite yourself, feel a small flush of pride, as though the ceiling were somehow yours. Two young men who look like clerks on a half-day holiday, nudging each other and whispering behind their hands, clearly more interested in seeing where a queen actually lives than in the tapestries. A family with 3 children, the youngest towed along by the wrist, wailing that his feet hurt, while his mother hisses at him to hush. "We did not come all this way from Reading for you to disgrace us in front of Her Majesty's furniture." An older woman travelling alone, dressed carefully but not richly, who stands longer in front of each painting than anyone else in the group, reading the little printed catalogue she has bought at the entrance as though it were scripture. Mr. Hollis is telling them about the Waterloo Chamber, the great room built to commemorate the victory over Bonaparte, hung with portraits of the sovereigns and generals and statesmen who brought it about. His voice has the particular cadence of a man who has said the same sentences 10,000 times and found a way to make them sound, each time freshly discovered. You are standing, he tells them, in a room that exists because of a single battle, fought on a single day, in a country most of you will never visit. Every face on these walls was in some way present, in body or in spirit, at that reckoning. The clerks stop whispering. Even the wailing child goes briefly quiet, perhaps sensing, the way children sometimes do, that something in the room has shifted register. You stand half hidden behind a doorway with your basket of candles, watching 15 ordinary people from ordinary lives stand very still in a room built to make them feel, for exactly as long as they are standing in it, like a small and privileged part of something enormous. That is the trade Windsor Castle makes with its visitors, and you will come to understand it better than most of the people making it. The castle sells awe. It sells the sensation of having stood where kings stood, having seen what kings see every day without thinking twice about it. What it does not sell, what it is built very deliberately never to sell, is any glimpse of the labour that produces the awe, or any glimpse of the parts of its own history it would rather the visitors never think to ask about at all. The public route, in those years, does not go everywhere. It goes through the staterooms, the ones Wyattville rebuilt and regilded through the 1820s and early 1830s under the old king's orders and the new king's money, spent as though there were no bottom to it, and it stops well short of anything private, anything working, anything that might remind a paying visitor that the castle is also, somewhere behind all this splendour, a house where real people eat their breakfast and quarrel over small things the way people do everywhere. And there is a third category, smaller than either of the others, which the guides do not mention and the guidebooks do not map. Rooms that are neither shown nor lived in. Rooms that are simply shut. You do not know about the shut rooms yet. That knowledge comes to you slowly, the way most real knowledge of a place does, in fragments dropped by people who've been there longer than you, and have stopped noticing they are dropping anything at all. The first fragment comes from old Ezra. Ezra Coombs has worked at Windsor Castle for longer than anyone currently employed there can quite reckon. Some say since before Waterloo, though you privately suspect he enjoys the uncertainty too much to correct anyone who guesses wrong. By the 1840s he is far too old and far too stiff in the joints for any real work, but the castle keeps its own, in its own way, and he has been given a pensioner's post as a porter at one of the lesser gates, where his main duty seems to be sitting on a stool telling visitors, with great authority, things that are not always strictly accurate. You meet him properly in your second month, sent to carry a jug of small beer down to the gatehouse for him on a bitter February afternoon. A kindness Mrs. Prewitt extends to the old man that she would extend to very few others, though she would deny it if asked. He takes the jug with hands so gnarled with age that the joints look like the knuckles of old tree roots, and studies you for a long moment with eyes that are pale and watery but still, somehow, sharp. New girl, Kello's daughter. Yes, sir. Don't sir me. I carried coal buckets same as you, 60 years gone. He drinks, wipes his mouth with the back of one crooked hand. You'll do the green drawing room this winter, and the crimson. They'll walk you through the state apartments till you could do it blind. Mrs. Prewitt says I'm quick. Everyone's quick at 14. He says it without unkindness, the same words Mrs. Prewitt used, and you're beginning to suspect it is simply what old servants say to new ones, a kind of ritual, like a blessing that isn't quite a blessing. You listen to me, girl. This castle's got more rooms than the ones they walk the visitors through. More rooms than the ones you'll ever be sent to dust, most like. And some of those rooms they're shut up for good reason, and the reason's not for you to go asking after. You're 14, and you have never in your life been told not to ask a question without immediately wanting to ask it more. What reason? Ezra looks at you for a long moment. Somewhere above you a bell begins to toll the hour. One of the many bells that mark time across the castle and the town below it. each with its own note, so a person who has lived here long enough can tell, without looking at any clock, roughly what hour and what task is due. Some things happened in this castle, he says slowly, that the family would rather the world forgot happened at all. And when a family's rich enough and grand enough, forgetting isn't hard. You just don't talk about it. You lock the door. You put a good painting in front of it if you have to. And after a while, there's nobody left alive who remembers, and it's like it never was. But you remember. I remember. He looks down into the empty jug as though something might still be at the bottom of it. I was a page boy here, girl, before you were dreamed of. Younger than you are now, and I saw things in this castle that nobody talks about at the supper table, things that would curdle your notion of what a king is. He will not say more that day, no matter how you push, and pushing too hard you quickly learn, only makes him fold up entirely, the way an old door swells shut in wet weather and simply will not be forced, but the seed is planted, and it sits in you for months, through the blacking of 100 more grates, and the sweeping of 100 more hearths, waiting for the season when it will finally come up through the ground. Spring comes to Windsor slowly that year, the way it does most years, mud before blossom, and with the spring comes the part of castle life you have heard about but not yet seen, the crowds on the terrace. The East Terrace, on fine Sunday evenings from Easter through the early autumn, is open to the public for what everyone simply calls the promenade, and it is, without any real competition, the single strangest custom you encounter in your whole time at Windsor. Ordinary people, townsfolk, day trippers up from London on the new railway, families in their good clothes, are permitted to walk along the broad gravel terrace below the castle's east front in the cool of the evening, and on those Sundays when the Queen and Prince Albert are in residence and inclined to take the air themselves, the ordinary people and the sovereign of the largest empire in the world walk more or less in the same space, at the same time, separated by nothing more than good manners and a respectful distance everyone somehow understands without being told. You get your first Sunday evening free in April and spend it, along with half the household similarly free standing on the fringes of the terrace crowd, craning your neck the same way the clergyman's wife craned hers at the ceiling of the green drawing-room. The evening is cool enough that your breath shows faintly, and the gravel underfoot is damp from an afternoon shower, releasing a mineral, rain-washed smell every time a boot presses down on it. Around you, several hundred people stand in loose clusters, murmuring, watching the doors at the end of the terrace, with the particular fixed patience of a crowd, waiting for something they've been told might happen, but cannot be guaranteed. And then it happens. A ripple moves through the crowd, starting near the doors and spreading outward, the way wind moves across a field of standing corn, and you hear the word passed from mouth to mouth before you see anything at all. The Queen. The Queen's come out. She is small, that is the first thing that strikes you. Absurdly small to be carrying the weight everyone in the crowd seems to feel she is carrying, walking with quick, purposeful steps beside a tall, fair man in a dark coat who must be the prince, their heads bent slightly toward each other in conversation too quiet to carry. There is no crown, no robes, just a woman in a walking dress and a man beside her, taking the evening air the way anyone might, except that several hundred strangers have gathered specifically to watch them do it. The crowd does not surge forward. There is an invisible line, understood by everyone though marked by nothing, past which nobody steps, and the effect is strange and almost theatrical. The royal couple moving through a corridor of watching faces that opens and closes around them like water around a boat, close enough to see clearly, far enough to preserve the fiction that this is not, in fact, an exhibition. Beside you, an older woman in a bonnet several seasons out of fashion presses a handkerchief to her mouth and, to your considerable surprise, begins to cry. "Are you well, ma'am?" you ask, because someone has to. "I saw her married," the woman says, not taking her eyes from the small figure on the terrace. 4 years back, stood in the crowd outside St. James's the whole day for a look at her carriage going past. And now, here she is, close enough to touch, walking about of a Sunday evening, same as the rest of us. "She's not the same as the rest of us, though," says a man nearby, not unkindly, more as an observation. "No," the woman agrees, still watching, still dabbing at her eyes. "But it's a comfort to see her try to be all the same." You think about that sentence for a long time afterward. It's a comfort to see her try to be, because that is exactly what the terrace promenade is. You come to understand over the following months of watching it happen, week after week, a carefully managed illusion of ordinariness offered up to a public that both wants desperately to believe the royal family are just like them and would be secretly, deeply disappointed to discover it was true. The Queen and the Prince walk on the terrace because it costs them nothing but an hour of a Sunday evening, and it buys in return an enormous and durable goodwill among people who will go home afterward and tell their neighbours for years about the evening they stood close enough to see the Queen's face. What none of the crowd on the terrace knows, what you yourself do not fully understand until you've been at the castle much longer, is how much the illusion costs on the other side of it. How many hours of gravel raking and hedge clipping and window polishing go into making the terrace and the view from it look, on a Sunday evening, like the effortless natural beauty of an ancient royal seat, rather than what it actually is, which is a stage set maintained at enormous and continuous labour, torn down and rebuilt in its particulars every single week of the season. There is a cost on the family's side too, though it takes you longer still to see it, and by the time you do see it in the autumn of 1844, it will already be tangled up with everything else this night is leading toward. It is that same spring that you have your first real conversation with a visitor, rather than simply passing unnoticed through a room while a tour moves through it. You're sent one Wednesday to carry a fresh supply of the little printed catalogues to the entrance where the tours assemble, and find yourself for a few unplanned minutes standing near the older woman from your second morning here, the one who reads every catalogue entry as though it were scripture, back at Windsor a second time, alone again, waiting for the next group to be called. "You're one of the housemaids," she says, not unkindly, taking in your apron and cap with a single practised glance. "I remember the grates. Somebody has to do the grates, I always think, though nobody ever mentions it in the guidebook." "No, ma'am, nobody mentions the grates." "What else don't they mention?" she asks. And there is something in the way she asks it, genuine curiosity, not the idle kind, that catches you off guard. You think of Susan's warning about doors having ears, and answer carefully. "A great deal happens before 11 o'clock, ma'am, that isn't there to be seen after it." She laughs, a short surprise sound. That's a diplomat's answer, if ever I heard one from a girl your age. "I've had practice," you say, which makes her laugh again, and for a moment, standing in the cold entrance hall with a stack of catalogues in your arms, you feel something you've not quite felt before in this castle. The sensation of being seen, briefly, as a person with a private mind of your own, rather than as a pair of useful hands attached to an apron. "I come every spring," she says, more quietly now, as the next group begins to gather. My husband was a soldier, fought in the wars against Bonaparte, though he never talked much of it before he died. I like to stand in the Waterloo chamber and imagine I understand a little of what he saw, though of course I never can, not really. It isn't the gold ceiling I come for, it's that. You have no answer ready for that, and she does not seem to expect one. She simply nods once, as if satisfied by the silence, and moves off to join her group as Mr. Hollis calls the hour. You watch her go and think, not for the last time, that the visitors filing through the state apartments each day are not the featureless crowd you first took them for on your second morning here. Each one carries something private into these public rooms. A grief, a hope, a memory of a husband who never talked much of the wars, and the castle, whatever else it is built to hide, does at least offer them somewhere large enough and quiet enough to set that private weight down for an hour, even if only to pick it back up again at the gate. The summer of 1841 brings Garter Day, the great annual ceremony of the Order of the Garter held in St. George's Chapel, and your first real experience of the castle at full overwhelming capacity. For a week beforehand, the entire household works at a pace you have not yet encountered, even in your first months of great blacking and drugget rolling. Because Garter Day means the knights processing in their velvet robes and black plumed hats through the lower ward to the chapel, watched by thousands of spectators packed against the barriers, and every surface the procession will pass, every window it might be glimpsed from, every carpet any dignitary's foot might touch, has to be perfect. You spend 3 days that week with your hands raw from lye soap, scrubbing the stone flags of a passage almost nobody of consequence will actually walk through, because Susan tells you that on Garter Day you clean everything, whether it is on the route or not, because you never know which way a duke's whim will take him, and it is easier to have scrubbed a floor nobody notices than to explain an unscrubbed one to Mrs. Prewitt afterward. On the day itself, you're given leave to watch the procession from his servant's vantage point above the lower ward, and the spectacle of it takes even your breath away, jaded as 3 days of scrubbing have made you toward the whole enterprise. The knights move in a long, glittering line, dark blue mantles and white plumes, and the ancient garter itself buckled below the knee of each, trumpets sounding from somewhere you cannot see, the crowd below roaring at intervals for reasons you cannot always follow. It is, you think, watching from your high window with chapped hands and an aching back, the most extraordinary theatre you've ever witnessed, and every single person taking part in it below has, at some point in the last week, been fed by, dressed by, or waited on by someone exactly like you. A week after Garter Day, worn thin from the extra work and given for once, a rare half-day to yourself, you do something you have been curious about since your first sight of the castle from the town below. You climb the round tower. It is not strictly forbidden to a servant, though it is not encouraged either, and it takes a word from Susan, who knows the porter on duty that afternoon, and vouches for you as a steady girl who won't go leaning over any parapet you oughtn't, before he will let you pass the door at the base and onto the long spiral stair. Wyatville raised this tower a full 30 feet higher than it had ever stood before, part of the old king's grand remaking of the castle in the years before you were born, precisely so it would dominate the skyline for miles in every direction, and climbing it, you understand, within the first 2 turns of the stair, exactly what that 30 feet cost in mortar and stone and men's broken backs. Because the stair itself seems to go on forever, narrow and dim, lit only by the occasional slit window. Your breath coming shorter with every turn, your legs beginning to burn in a way quite different from the ache of a morning's great blacking. A bright, climbing ache, not a dull, grinding one. You come out at last onto the open leads at the top, into a wind that nearly takes your cap clean off your head, and have to stand still a moment with one hand braced against the cold stone parapet, letting your breath catch up with you before you trust yourself to look. When you do look, the sight nearly undoes you. Windsor spreads out below in every direction, the town's rooftops clustered close around the base of the hill like chicks around a hen, the river coiling silver through green water meadows to the south, Eton's own grey towers rising just across the bridge, close enough that you fancy you can make out boys moving on the playing fields, though you're almost certainly imagining the detail at this distance. Beyond the town, farmland rolls away in patchwork greens and browns as far as you can see, hedgerows stitching the fields together, a scatter of church spires marking villages you have never visited and probably never will. Someone told you once, you cannot now remember who, that on a clear day you can see into a dozen counties from up here, and standing in the wind with your eyes stinging from it, you believe every word of the claim, extravagant as it sounds. The wind up here smells different from anywhere else in the castle. No coal smoke this high, no boiled mutton, nothing but cold, clean air with a faint mineral edge to it, and underneath that, very faintly, the green smell of the whole county spread out below, cut grass and turned earth and the river itself, carried up on the same currents that make your skirts snap and tug at your legs like something alive. You think, standing there, of the lower ward far beneath your feet, where a week ago several thousand people packed themselves shoulder to shoulder to watch a procession you helped, in your own small way, make possible, and from up here that whole vast crowd would have looked like nothing at all, a smudge of colour against grey stone gone within the hour, leaving no more trace on the tower than a moth leaves on a lit window. You think of the servants' hall 200 feet below you, the noise and the bells and the long scrubbed table, all of it reduced from this height to something you could cover with the flat of one hand, and you think, though you could not yet have said why the thought arrives just here, just now, of Ezra's unfinished sentence from the winter before, about a king hidden away in rooms not far from wherever you happened to be standing at the time. From up here you realize you cannot see any single room of the castle at all. You can see the whole shape of it, the whole outline against the sky, and none of what happens inside any particular window. It occurs to you, not for the last time, that this might be exactly how the family themselves are obliged to think of their own history, not room by room, not grief by grief, but as a single vast shape to be maintained, viewed from a great enough distance that the cracks in any one part of it simply disappear into the overall grandeur of the whole. You stay up on the leads longer than you mean to until the porter below calls up that he'll be needing to lock the door before his supper and climb back down the long spiral stair with your legs trembling now from the descent as much as the climb, back into the ordinary press of castle noise and errands and Mrs. Prewitt's list for the following morning, carrying the view with you the way you will carry eventually one or two other things this castle shows you that are not meant for every visitor's eyes. That November brings something you will remember more clearly than Garter Day, more clearly than almost anything else in your first year, the birth of the Prince of Wales. The castle has been in a state of hushed anticipation for weeks by the time the news comes on the 9th of November that the Queen has been safely delivered of a son, and the effect on the household is instantaneous and total. Bells begin ringing across the town before you have even heard the news properly relayed below stairs, and by evening there are bonfires lit on the slopes below the castle and in the meadows beyond. Points of orange light scattered across the darkening landscape as far as you can see from an upstairs window, each one lit by ordinary people in ordinary villages who have never set foot inside the castle walls and never will, celebrating the birth of a child they will also never meet, because that child will one day, in the fullness of time none of them can predict, be their king, an heir. Susan says that night, unpicking her apron string with fingers stiff from a day of extra polishing done at short notice. Because word of the birth means half the silver has to be got ready for a celebration dinner nobody had planned for that morning. Whole country's been holding its breath for this one since the first was only a girl. Only a girl, you repeat, thinking of the small determined figure you watched walking the terrace that spring. And something in your tone must carry more than you intend, because Susan glances up sharply. Don't let Mrs. Prewitt hear you say it like that. I didn't say anything. You said it with your face, Susan says, not unkindly, going back to her apron strings. Keep that face for your own room, girl. Doors have ears in this house, and so do walls, more than you'd credit. Doors have ears, and so do walls, more than you'd credit. You file the sentence away, the way you've been filing away sentences all year, without quite knowing yet which of them will matter later, and which will simply evaporate into the general fog of things older servants say to younger ones. This one, it will turn out, matters a great deal. Winter that year brings its own particular labour, the cold making every task harder and slower, water freezing in the ewers overnight, so the first job of the morning is often breaking a skin of ice before you can even wash your own face. Coal that has to be carried up more flights of stairs than you can count because every fireplace in every occupied room needs feeding from before dawn until well past dark. Your hands crack in the cold, the skin across your knuckles splitting into thin, painful lines that sting whenever you plunge them into water. And Susan shows you one bitter January evening, almost exactly a year after your arrival, how to work a little mutton fat into the cracks before bed, the only remedy available to a girl in your position, since the lavender-scented creams the ladies of the household use are as far beyond your reach as the moon. But winter also brings Christmas, and Christmas that year brings the tree. It is Prince Albert's doing, this business of a fir tree brought indoors and dressed with candles and sweetmeats in the German fashion he grew up with, a custom not entirely unknown in England before, but never so grandly displayed as the household is set to displaying it now, in the private rooms where the family will gather on Christmas Eve. You're not permitted anywhere near the actual dressing of the tree. That is work for more senior hands, under close supervision, given how many lit candles are involved and how catastrophic a fire in the private apartments would be. But you are sent 2 days before Christmas to help carry branches of holly and ivy up from the kitchen court for the wreaths and swags that will decorate the passages the family will actually use, and in doing so you get your first real glimpse into rooms that are neither the grand state apartments shown to visitors nor the bare working corridors of the servants' quarters, but something in between, private, lived in, ordinary in a way that startles you. There is a child's rocking horse in one of the ante-rooms, worn smooth on the nose where small hands have evidently patted it 1,000 times. There is a half-finished piece of needlework left on a chair, abandoned mid-stitch, the needle still threaded and stuck through the fabric, as though whoever was working on it meant to come back to it in a moment and simply never did. There is, on a side table, you pass carrying an armful of holly that scratches your wrists raw through your sleeve, a small framed portrait of the young Princess Royal, not yet walking in the picture, propped up as casually as any mother anywhere might prop up a portrait of her firstborn, It is the ordinariness of it that unsettles you more than any of the gilded splendour of the state apartments ever has. You have spent a year now believing, without quite putting the belief into words, that the family who lives above you exists in some permanently elevated state, breakfasting on gold plate in rooms that never grow cluttered, never smell of anything but beeswax and fresh flowers. And here's a worn rocking horse and an abandoned bit of sewing. Evidence that somewhere behind the ceremony and the terrace walks and the bonfires lit in their honour, there is simply a family, muddling through the ordinary chaos of small children and half-finished tasks the same as any family anywhere, only with better wallpaper. On Christmas Eve itself, you're given a rare quarter hour near dusk to slip up a back stair and glimpse, through a half-open door you have no business lingering at, the tree itself once it is finally dressed, not touching it, not even fully entering the room, simply standing in the doorway with your heart beating faster than the errand supposedly running requires. It stands taller than any man in the household, set in a great tub disguised with a fall of white linen meant to suggest snow, its branches hung with small wax candles not yet lit, with gilded nuts and strings of sugared almonds and little baskets of sweetmeats tied on with coloured ribbon, and beneath it, wrapped in paper and set out with a careful precision that speaks of hours of some senior servant's labour, a scatter of small gifts for the nursery. The resin smell of the fir reaches you even from the doorway, sharp and cold and green, entirely unlike anything else in a castle that mostly smells of beeswax and coal smoke and old stone. And for a moment you simply breathe it in, this one clean forest smell dropped whole into the middle of so much gilded formality, and understand, without being able to say quite why, that this is the nearest thing to magic you are ever likely to witness inside these walls. Later that evening, once the candles are lit under careful supervision, and the family has gathered for an hour no servant is permitted to see, you stand with Susan and half a dozen others in the passage below, listening to the faint muffled sound of a child's delighted shriek carrying down through the old stone. The Princess Royal, not yet a year old, but plainly enough taken with the spectacle of candlelight and colour to make her feelings known to the whole household below. Susan smiles at the sound, an unguarded smile you've rarely seen on her. "There's a sound worth a 12-hour day," she says, and for once does not seem to mind saying something soft aloud. You mention the rocking horse, and the tree, and the shriek in the passage to Ezra on one of your Sunday visits to the gatehouse with his jug of beer, expecting him to agree, or to laugh, or to say something wise about how royalty is only flesh and blood underneath the robes. Instead, he goes very quiet. "You want to be careful, thinking that way," he says finally. "Thinking what way?" "Thinking they're ordinary. Thinking because you saw a worn-out rocking horse. That means the whole business is just a family same as any other, with a bit more guilt on it." He shakes his head slowly. "I thought that too once, when I was young enough to still think it. And then I learned different." "Learned what different?" He is quiet again, longer this time, and you have learned by now not to push too hard, too fast, that Ezra's memories come out on their own schedule and no other, like water finding its own level. So you wait, watching the last of the daylight fade over the lower ward, listening to the distant sound of a work gang, somewhere still hauling stone for one of the endless building projects the prince seems to have no end of appetite for. "There's a family," Ezra says at last. "Same as any other family, right up until the moment there isn't. Right up until the crown needs something the family can't give it. And then you find out fast how much of the family part was ever real, and how much was only ever theatre. Same as the terrace walks, same as the whole business. I saw a king in this castle once who wasn't fit to be seen by anybody, and they hid him. Not out of cruelty, mind, I'll not say that. Out of shame, maybe, or duty, or something in between the two I never rightly worked out. But they hid him for years, girl. Years. In rooms not far from where you're carrying your holly branches right now. And half the people walking those passages today have no notion it ever happened, and the family means to keep it that way. Your mouth has gone dry. You mean the old king, the mad one? I mean His Majesty King George III, Ezra says, with a formality that sounds, in the fading light, almost like a rebuke, who reigned longer than any king of this country before him, who lost his wits for good after the year 11, and who spent his last years in this castle blind and deaf, and out of his mind, talking to people who weren't there, playing at his harpsichord for hours together with nobody but his keepers to hear him, and who died in a room in this castle in the January of 1820, having not properly known where he was, nor who any living soul around him was, for the better part of a decade. The holly branches in your arms suddenly feel very heavy. Where, you ask, and have to stop and start again, because your voice comes out smaller than you mean it to. Where in the castle? Ezra looks at you for a long moment, and something crosses his weathered face that might be regret at having said as much as he already has. Not for you to know, he says, and not for you to go asking after neither. That's a room the family would sooner the whole world forgot ever had a door in it. You go poking at grief that old and that carefully buried girl, and you'll not find gratitude waiting for you at the bottom of it. You'll find trouble. Now go on. Take your holly up before Mrs. Prewitt comes looking for both of us. You go. But the sentence stays lodged in you the way a splinter stays lodged under skin, invisible from the outside, aching faintly whenever you brush against it, for the better part of 3 years. Those 3 years pass the way. Years pass in a life built around physical labour, not slowly exactly, but marked more by the accumulation of small competencies than by any dramatic change. You grow 2 inches. Your hands, which arrived at the castle soft and unmarked, develop the particular calluses of a housemaid, a hard ridge across the base of each finger from years of gripping brush handles, a permanent faint roughness to the skin of your palms that no amount of mutton fat ever entirely softens. You learn to tell, by smell alone, whether a grate has been properly cleared of clinker or only looks clear. You learn the private rhythms of the castle's public performance so well you could, if pressed, have conducted Mr. Hollis's tour yourself, room by room, painting by painting, though naturally nobody would ever dream of letting a housemaid do such a thing. The seasons themselves teach you things no single conversation ever could. Summer at Windsor means long days starting before 4 and not properly ending until 9 or later. The light lingering pale gold over the long walk while you're still on your knees somewhere blacking a grate. Nobody thanks you for blacking. It means the smell of cut grass drifting up from the private gardens on a warm evening, sweet and green, mixing strangely with the ever-present undertone of coal smoke that never quite leaves the castle even at the height of June. It means your collar sticking damp to the back of your neck by mid-morning, and the particular misery of ironing linen in a room with the fire kept lit regardless of the season, sweat running down between your shoulder blades while your hands, by long habit, move the heavy iron in the same even strokes regardless of the heat. Autumn brings the mud, tracked in from the gardens and the long walk on 100 pairs of boots a day. So half of your October and November each year is spent on your knees again, this time scrubbing flagstones rather than blacking grates, working at ground-in dirt with a stiff brush and cold water until your knuckles crack and your knees, even through your apron, ache with a deep bruised soreness no amount of straw bedding quite soothes away at night. Winter, when it comes hard, brings its own strange gift. In the January of 1843, your second winter of service, the cold sets in deep enough and long enough that the Thames itself begins to freeze along its slower reaches downriver of the town, not solid enough for a proper frost fair such as the old stories tell of from 100 years before, but solid enough in the shallows near the meadows for the town's children and not a few of its adults to venture cautiously out onto the ice on a Sunday afternoon. You and Dinah, your roommate under the eaves, given leave together for once, walk down from the castle bundled in every spare shawl either of you owns, and stand at the edge of the frozen shallows watching boys slide and whoop and occasionally crash through into ankle-deep freezing water with a shriek that turns instantly to laughter once they realise they are not in fact drowned. "Try it," Dinah says, tugging at your sleeve, already easing one boot out onto the ice herself. "I'll break my neck." You won't. It's thick enough here, look. They've all been at it an hour and nobody's gone through past their ankle. You go, in the end, because refusing feels somehow worse than the risk of falling, and find the ice strange under your boots, not slippery in the smooth way you expected, but gritty with a skin of refrozen snow, your own breath clouding in front of your face with every startled laugh as you totter, arms out for balance, a few unsteady feet from the bank. It is, for perhaps 20 minutes, entirely unlike anything else in your working life. A stretch of time with no grate waiting at the end of it, no bell to answer, nothing required of your hands at all except to keep your own balance on a surface that wants, gently, to take it away from you. You fall twice, hard enough the second time to wind you, and come up laughing anyway, your palms stinging from the impact, ice crystals melting cold against your wrists where your sleeves have ridden up. Walking back up the hill afterward, cheeks burning from the cold and the laughing both, you think that this, 20 stolen minutes on a frozen river with a friend, your hands for once entirely your own, is as close as a girl in your position is likely to come to the kind of freedom the family upstairs seem to take for granted every day of their lives. You do not resent them for it, not exactly, but you notice the difference, the way you've learned to notice most things at Windsor, and file it away with all the rest. That same winter you walk down into the town itself on one of your rare, full free days, to see your father in the room above the timber yard he has rented since your mother died, and the walk down the hill teaches you something. The walk up it 4 years ago did not yet have the eyes to teach you. The castle sits above the town the way a great ship sits above the water it displaces, and the closer you get to your father's lodging, the more clearly you can measure the distance between the two worlds you now belong to, one by birth and one by employment. The lane where he lives is narrow and unpaved, thick with frozen mud churned by cartwheels into ridges hard as iron, and the smell of it, coal smoke here too, but thinner, meaner, mixed with the reek of a drain nobody has money to have properly seen to, is nothing like the smoke of the castle's well-tended chimneys, banked and fed by servants whose whole trade is keeping a fire drawing clean. Your father's room is a single chamber with a single small grate, no bigger, you realise with a small internal jolt, than the hearth of the smallest closet off the green drawing room, you black twice a week without a second thought. He has kept it as decent as a working man alone can keep such a room. But decent here means something entirely different from what it means 200 feet up the hill. There is one chair, there is bread and a little cheese, and small beer he has saved from his own wages to offer you, poured with a careful pride that makes your throat tighten. You look well fed at least, he says, turning your chin gently with one rough finger to study your face in the thin window light. That's something. That's not nothing, girl. They feed us proper up there. Bread and dripping most days. Meat on Sundays. Meat on Sundays, he repeats. And something in his face, some old private calculation, softens and hardens at once. Well, that's more than I can promise you here, and no shame in saying it plain. You do not tell him, that visit or any other, about the gilded ceilings, or the tree dressed with sugared almonds. It is not that you mean to keep it from him exactly. It is only that the two worlds sit so oddly together in your own chest, most days, that you've not yet found the words to carry one of them whole into the other without the telling sounding, somehow, like either boasting or complaint, and you want to give your father neither. There is one incident in the summer of 1843 that you will remember for years afterward as the closest the public route itself ever comes to tearing its careful fiction open in front of a paying crowd. You're working in the grand reception room that morning, touching up a smear on a window pane that has caught the light badly, when a tour group of some 20 visitors comes through under Mr. Hollis's guidance, and among them a boy of perhaps 8, overexcited and unwatched for a single crucial moment by a mother distracted by the ceiling, reaches out and closes his fist around the edge of a heavy curtain tassel, tugging hard enough that the whole curtain shudders on its pole, and a cloud of old dust, dislodged from the folds, drifts down visibly through a shaft of window light. The room goes very still. Mr. Hollis's easy, well-worn narration stops mid-sentence. The boy's mother gasps and seizes his wrist so hard he yelps, more startled than hurt, and for one long, suspended moment the entire party stands frozen, staring at the swaying curtain and the drifting dust, as though watching a small crack open in the whole magnificent illusion they have paid their shilling to walk through. You, closest to the scene with your cloth still in hand, do the only thing that occurs to you. You step forward, catch the swinging tassel, and still it with a firm, practised hand, the way you have stilled 100 unruly curtains during your ordinary morning rounds, and say nothing at all, simply smooth the fabric back into its proper fall and step away again, as though nothing whatever has happened. It is, in its way, the smallest possible act, and yet you feel doing it, the exact same instinct that will drive Susan a year later to hustle you out of a sealed room and lie smoothly to a foreman about structural concerns, the instinct so deeply trained into every servant in this castle, it hardly feels like a decision at all, to catch the illusion before it falls, to smooth the fabric, to let the visitors walk on believing that nothing here is ever less than perfectly, permanently in order. Nothing to trouble yourselves over, Mr. Hollis says smoothly, finding his voice again, and the tour moves on, the boy's mother throwing you a grateful, faintly mortified glance over her shoulder as she goes, and within a minute the room has settled back into its practised silence as though the curtain had never swayed at all. You watch the Princess Royal grow from an infant carried by a nursemaid into a small girl occasionally, on fine mornings, glimpse being walked in the private gardens, and you watch the Prince of Wales arrive as a red-faced newborn wrapped in shawls and grow, by the autumn of 1844, into a toddling boy of nearly 3, who has, according to Below-Stairs gossip that travels with astonishing speed and only moderate accuracy, already worn out 2 nursery maids with his temper, and you watch the building work. Prince Albert, it becomes clear over those years, is a man who does not seem able to look at any part of Windsor Castle without immediately identifying 17 ways it might be improved. Drains are dug up and relaid, kitchens that have served, more or less unaltered, since the days of George IV are gutted and rebuilt with new ranges and better ventilation, a project you follow with particular interest because the old kitchens, whatever their faults, at least held a familiar geography, and the new ones, for months, are a chaos of exposed brick and workmen's tools and dust that gets into everything and has to be cleaned out of the state apartment's carpets nearly every single day. Rooms are replumbed for water closets, a modernisation some of the older servants regard with open suspicion, Ezra among them, who mutters more than once that a castle that has stood 800 years hardly needs a Frenchman's notion of plumbing to improve it, though nobody has the heart to correct him that the notion in question is, if anything, more German than French, given whose idea it evidently is. You spend the better part of 1 entire fortnight when you are 16, helping to clear the old kitchen before the new ranges go in, and it is work unlike almost anything else you've done in the castle, closer in its heaviness to what you imagine a labourer's work must feel like than anything your training as a housemaid has prepared you for. The old range itself, black with a century of use, has to be dismantled piece by heavy iron piece, each part hauled out through a passage never designed for the purpose, your palms blistering within the first hour against iron edges rough with rust and old grease. No amount of scrubbing has ever fully lifted. The stone floor beneath, once the range has gone, shows scorch marks and grease stains laid down in patterns that must represent decades, generations even, of cooks standing in exactly the same spots to do exactly the same work, and looking at those dark ghostly outlines on the flagstones, you feel, for a moment, something almost like tenderness for a room you've never much liked, this ugly, practical, unglamorous heart of the whole grand enterprise, where nobody ever brings a paying visitor, and where, none the less, every single meal that makes the gilded rooms upstairs possible has been produced, hour after hour, for longer than anyone now living can properly account for. The dust from the demolition gets into your lungs in a way the ordinary dust of housework never has. A dry, choking grit that has you coughing for days afterward. And by the end of the fortnight your hands are a mess of small cuts and blisters. Susan inspects with a critical eye and pronounces, not unkindly, a proper set of working hands at last, as though the injury were itself a kind of graduation. The work has its own particular rhythm, its own noise that becomes over the years as familiar to you as the church bells across the town. There is the flat percussive knock of hammers on stone somewhere in a distant wing, muffled by intervening walls into something almost gentle, and there is the sharper, more urgent rasp of a mason's chisel worked close by, a sound that sets your teeth on edge no matter how many times you hear it. There is the particular grit of builder's dust that finds its way into everything regardless of how many dust sheets are hung, so fine it's barely visible in the air, and yet leaves a pale film on every polished surface within a day of any nearby wall being opened. A film you and the other housemaids wipe away each morning only to find it returned by evening, an endless small war against a substance that never runs out. Your hands, already roughened from years of brushes and blacking, grow rougher still that autumn, chapped by the constant handling of dust rags soaked in water gone grey within minutes of being wrung out. There is, too, a particular kind of talk that travels among the workmen, and, from them, down into the servants' hall, talk you only half attend to at first, the ordinary grumbling of tired men about a job that keeps expanding beyond what they were told to expect. But as the autumn deepens and the work crew moves steadily along the old North Range, room by shuttered room, the grumbling takes on a different edge. One of the older masons, a heavy-set man with forearms scarred white from some old accident, tells his mates over their midday bread that his own father worked at Windsor as a young man back in the old king's reign, and that his father always said there were rooms along that range a sensible man didn't ask too many questions about, not if he wanted to keep his position. Load of old talk, says one of the younger men, not entirely convincingly. Maybe, the older mason says, you go on believing that if it helps you sleep. You, carrying a bundle of clean dust sheets past the open door where the men are taking their break, hear just enough of the exchange to feel the small hard knot that has sat in your chest since Ezra's half-told story, 3 Christmases before, draw suddenly, sharply tight. You say nothing. You've learned, by now, that saying nothing is very often the wisest thing a housemaid in this castle can do, and you carry your dust sheets on without breaking stride, though your heart is beating harder than the errand alone would account for. It is this building work, this restless appetite of the prince's for opening up and improving and modernising every corner of the old fabric, that finally brings you, in October of 1844, to the door that has no plaque. The passage runs along the ground floor of the North Range, a stretch of the castle that has never, in your 3.5 years of service, been part of any route you are regularly sent to work in. It is cold in a way that feels different from ordinary castle cold. A stillness to the air that suggests rooms which are not regularly heated, not regularly used, not regularly breathed in by anyone at all. You're sent there on a Tuesday morning with Susan and 2 other housemaids, along with a work gang of 4 men under a foreman named Gorton, because the prince has decided, for reasons nobody below stairs has been told, though there is a great deal of speculation, that a section of disused rooms along this passage is to be opened up, cleared, and eventually incorporated into a suite of offices for the growing household of clerks and secretaries the modern royal establishment apparently now requires. Nobody's been in half these rooms in donkey's years, Gorton tells the assembled cleaning party, consulting a rough plan sketched on a scrap of paper. Some of the doors are painted shut near enough. We'll take the panels off where we have to. You girls follow behind and get the dust out before the surveyor comes through this afternoon. The first 3 rooms are unremarkable, if eerie in their long neglect. Furniture under dust sheets gone grey with age, a smell of mildew and old paper, a dead bird skeleton on a window-sill where it must have got in through a broken pane years before and never found its way out again. You work through them with the mechanical efficiency 3.5 years of practice has given you, sweeping, dusting, hauling the worst of the debris out to a cart in the passage, and it is not until mid-morning when Gorton's men move to the 4th door in the sequence that anything changes. The 4th door does not want to open. It is not locked, exactly. Gorton establishes that much within a few minutes, working a thin iron bar into the frame to test it, but it has been painted over so many times and swollen so thoroughly by decades of damp that it has in effect become part of the wall around it, fused shut by nothing more dramatic than neglect and old paint and the slow, patient work of time. It takes two of the workmen the better part of half an hour, levering and hammering at the frame, before the door finally gives way with a groan and a shower of paint flakes that fill the air with a fine white dust. The sound it makes as it finally tears loose is not like any door you have heard open before. Not the ordinary click and swing of a well-kept hinge, but a long tearing groan, wood fibres parting from decades-old paint, followed by a soft heavy thud as the door itself, unbalanced, swings hard against the inside wall. A gust of trapped air comes out to meet you, and it is cold in a way that has nothing to do with the passage's own chill. A still, close, unmoving cold. The particular cold of a space that has not felt a draught or a change of season in longer than you have been alive. Underneath the dust and old paint there is another smell threaded through it, faint but unmistakable once noticed. Damp plaster, and something drier and staler beneath that, like old paper left too long in a drawer, or the inside of a chest that has not been opened in a generation. The room behind it is dark. The window, there is only one set high in the wall, smaller than any window you've yet seen in the castle, is shuttered from the inside, and even once Gorton's men force the shutter, the light that comes through is thin and grudging, filtered through decades of grime on the glass. You're meant to wait in the passage until the men have cleared the worst of the debris and confirmed the floor is sound. That's the arrangement. The same arrangement that is held for the previous 3 rooms. But Susan, sent ahead to check something with the foreman about which dust sheets need washing separately, calls you forward before the usual routine has quite been established, and so it happens that you're standing in the doorway of that 5th room, holding your broom at the exact moment the thin grey light finally reaches far enough into the space to show what is actually inside it. There is a chair. It is unlike any other piece of furniture you have encountered in 4 years of moving through this castle's rooms, grand and plain alike. It is heavy, built of dark wood, with arms thicker and more solid than any ordinary chair would need, and fixed to those arms, cracked and stiffened with age, but unmistakable in what they once were, are leather straps, buckled and worn at the edges from what must have been, once, repeated use. Your broom handle knocks softly against the door frame. You have not meant to let it slip in your grip, but your hands have gone strange, distant, not quite yours. The window, you now see, is not merely small, it is barred. Thin iron bars set into the stone on the inside of the shutter, positioned so that from outside, in the ordinary light of an ordinary day, nobody walking the grounds below would ever think to look twice at what appears to be simply one more narrow castle window among hundreds, and on the wall beside the chair, at roughly the height of a seated man's reach, scratched into the old plaster in lines too deliberate, too repeated to be anything but purposeful, are marks, dozens of them, not words, not quite, though here and there among the scratches you think you can make out the shape of a letter, a fragment of something that might once have been a name, or might only be your own mind trying too hard to find meaning in what is, perhaps, simply the marks of a man scoring the wall with his fingernail, over and over for reasons that died with whoever made them. Matty? Susan's voice, sharp and low, cuts across the room from behind you, and you turn to find her face gone the colour of the plaster itself, all the ordinary weary patience wiped clean off it and replaced with something you have never seen there before. Fear, you think at first. But watching her eyes move across the room, the chair, the bars, the marks on the wall, you revise the thought. Not fear exactly, recognition. Susan is not surprised by what is in this room. She has known, or half known, or heard rumoured exactly what might be in a room like this, in exactly the same vague, unspoken way you yourself have half known it since a winter evening 3 years ago at the gatehouse. And the fear on her face is not fear of the room, but fear of what happens next, now that a housemaid under her charge, 17 now, time has slid past the way it does, has seen it too. Out, Susan says. Now. Both of us. Out of this room. What is it, you say? Though even as you say it, some part of you already knows, has known since the moment the light caught the leather straps on the chair arms, and only once, in the way a person sometimes wants even a terrible confirmation, to hear someone else say it aloud. Out, Susan says again, and takes you by the arm hard enough to hurt, and pulls you back into the passage, pulling the broken door as near to closed as its ruined hinges will allow. Gorton and his men are already 20 feet down the passage, occupied with the next door in the sequence, and it is clear from the ordinary way they're talking among themselves, joking about something one of them said the previous evening in a public house, that none of them has yet grasped what the room actually contains. To them it is simply another disused chamber, one more piece of the endless catalogue of forgotten rooms this rambling old building seems to produce without end. Susan does not enlighten them. Instead, she walks straight to Gorton and, in a voice pitched for his ears only, says something you cannot quite catch, though you see the foreman's face change, see him glance back down the passage toward the broken door with an expression that shifts, in the space of 2 seconds, from mild curiosity to something considerably more careful. Right, Gorton says, loud enough now for the whole party to hear. That room's not for today. Structural concern. We'll seal it back up and Mr. Whiteville's people can have a proper look before we go any further. Everyone finish up what's in hand and we'll leave the rest for another day. It is, you understand immediately, a lie, and not even a very carefully constructed one. But it works exactly as it is meant to work because none of the workmen have any reason to doubt it. And within 10 minutes, the broken door has been propped roughly back into its frame, a length of rope strung across the passage in front of it as a makeshift barrier, and the whole party has moved on to the 6th room as though the 5th had never been opened at all. It is not until much later that evening, after the day's work is done, and the household has settled into its narrow window of rest before the next dawn's labour begins again, that Susan finds you in the small shared room under the eaves where you have slept, these past 2 years, with Dinah, who is mercifully out of the room that particular evening, sent on an errand that will keep her occupied for the better part of an hour. Susan sits down on the edge of your narrow bed without being invited, which is itself unusual enough to tell you how seriously she's taking this conversation. You're not to speak of what we saw today, she says. Not to Dinah, not to your father, not to anyone. Do you understand me? I understand you're frightened, you say, but I don't understand why. Susan is quiet for a moment, turning something over. A decision, you think, though you cannot yet tell which way it will fall. There's things in this world, she says at last, that a family has a right to keep private, even a family as grand as this one, especially a family as grand as this one, because everything they do, everyone they've ever been, gets turned into a story the moment it's known, and not always a kind story. You think that room was cruelty. I could see it on your face. Wasn't it? I don't know, Susan says, and for once the honesty in her voice is more unsettling than any evasion would have been. I wasn't alive when whatever happened in that room happened. Neither were you. We don't know what it was to nurse a man who'd lost his mind entire, who didn't know his own wife from a stranger, who by all the old stories used to rave for hours and had to be kept from harming himself or the people trying to care for him. Maybe that chair was cruelty. Maybe it was the only kindness anybody left to him could think to give, keeping him from throwing himself through a window in the middle of some terror only he could see. I don't know, Matty, and neither do you, and that not knowing is exactly why it's not ours to go telling stories about. You sit with that for a long moment, the scratches on the plaster wall still vivid behind your eyes whenever you close them, and you find, somewhat to your own surprise, that you cannot entirely disagree. Did you know, you ask eventually, before today? Really no, not just heard talk. Susan is quiet long enough that you think she will not answer this either. My aunt was in service here before me, she says at last. Under nurse back in the old days. She never said much of it plain, but she said enough once or twice, when she'd had a drop more sherry than she meant to at Christmas, that I'd worked out the shape of it long before today. I hoped I was wrong. I think some part of me went on hoping I was wrong right up until that shutter came off and the light got in. She looks down at her own hands laced together in her lap. It's a hard thing, having a hope like that finally proved wrong. Harder than never having had the hope at all, I sometimes think. What happens to the room now? Now, Susan says, standing, smoothing her apron with hands that are, you notice, not quite steady. Mrs. Prewitt has a word with the comptroller's office, and someone above both of us decides what's to be done, and in 3 days' time, most like, that door will have a new lock on it and a fresh coat of paint, and it'll go back to being a bit of panelling nobody looks at twice. And in 100 years, girl, nobody will ever know there was a chair in that room at all, unless somebody like you decides to go telling stories she has no business telling. She's not entirely wrong about the timeline, though she's off by 2 days rather than 3. On the Thursday, a man you've never seen before, dressed too well to be ordinary household staff, arrives with 2 assistants and spends the better part of the day in and around the 5th room, with the door propped fully open for the first time and a lamp brought in to give proper light, making notes in a leather book, measuring the barred window with a folding rule, running his fingers along the scratched marks on the plaster with an expression of professional detachment. You, watching from the passage where you've been sent to sweep up the last of the old dust, find almost more unsettling than the room itself had been. Whatever is written in that leather book, you never learn. By the Friday evening the chair is gone, carried out under a dust sheet by 2 men who handle it with the careful, faintly reluctant respect people generally reserve for something they've been told, without being given reasons, to treat as important. By the following Monday the bars have been taken from the window, the shutter mended and painted, and a fresh door, a proper one this time, hung true, opening and closing without complaint, has replaced the swollen, paint-fused wreck Gorton's men forced open the week before. You're there yourself the following Monday when the fresh door is hung, watching from a few feet down the passage as a joiner tests the new hinges, swinging the door open and shut a dozen times, checking that it moves clean and quiet and true, with none of the groaning reluctance of the door it replaces. Each smooth swing makes a small sound now, a soft, ordinary click of a well-fitted latch, nothing at all like the tearing groan of 10 days before, and you find yourself flinching very slightly at each repetition all the same, your body remembering a sound your ears are no longer actually hearing. And the following Wednesday, precisely as Susan predicted, a party of 18 visitors from Bristol walks along a section of newly refurbished corridor on the ground floor of the North Range, guided by Mr. Hollis, who tells them, with the same unhurried authority he brings to every room on his route, that this passage was until recently disused, and is now being brought back into service as the growing royal household requires ever more space for its business. A small but telling example, he says, of how even so ancient a seat as Windsor Castle must continually renew itself to serve the needs of the age. Nobody in the party of 18 asks what the passage was disused for. Nobody thinks to ask, because nobody has any reason to imagine there is anything to ask about. They walk on, admiring the fresh paint and the good proportions of the corridor, and within the hour they will be back on the public route proper, gazing up at the gilded ceiling of the Waterloo chamber, telling each other, quite sincerely, that there is nowhere in England to compare with it. You watch them go from a service doorway, a stack of clean linen in your arms, and feel something you do not entirely have words for. Not quite anger, not quite grief, though grief is somewhere in it. An odd second-hand grief for a king who died 5 years before you were even born, whom you never knew and never could have known, and for whom you are nonetheless the only person in that entire passage, visitors and guide alike, thinking of him at all in that particular moment. Mostly what you feel is the specific lonely weight of knowing something true that nobody around you knows, and understanding with a clarity that startles you that you're never going to be able to unknow it, and that most of the people who pass through this castle for the rest of your life, and for a great many lives after yours, are going to walk these same halls in a state of complete, comfortable ignorance about what those halls actually contain, and that this ignorance is not an accident. It is the product. It is, in its own strange way, the thing the castle is actually built to manufacture. Not gold ceilings, not fine views, but a particular, curated, protective forgetting, offered up to anyone willing to pay a shilling for the privilege of not knowing too much. You think of Ezra's words from 3 years before, when you were still new enough to think a worn rocking horse was proof the family were ordinary underneath it all. There's a family, same as any other family, right up until the moment there isn't. You understand the sentence properly now, in a way you could not have when you first heard it, standing in the dusk outside the gatehouse with an armful of Christmas holly. You do not tell Dinah. You do not tell your father on your next half-day visit down into the town, though you come close twice, and both times find the words simply will not come out of you, as if some part of you has already, without quite deciding to, taken up Susan's charge and made it your own. You do, eventually, tell one more person, but not for another year, and not until circumstances have changed enough that it seems, to you at least, that the telling can do no further harm. That person is Ezra, and the telling happens on an evening in the autumn of 1845, almost exactly a year after the door came open, at the gatehouse, with the jug of small beer between you the same as always, the ritual unbroken across 4.5 years of Sundays. I saw the room, you tell him, without preamble, because by now there is no need for one between you. Last October, the one you wouldn't name for me. Ezra sets down his cup very carefully, and for a long moment says nothing at all. I told you not to go looking. I didn't go looking. It came open in front of me. I couldn't help what I saw. He nods slowly, an old man's nod, the kind that seems to carry the weight of every similar nod he has given across 60 years of service. And now you know? Now I know. You hesitate. Was I right? Was it cruelty? Ezra is quiet for so long you begin to think he will not answer at all, that this too will be one of the things he takes to his grave rather than hands to you. But at last he speaks, and his voice, when it comes, is quieter than you have ever heard it. I was a boy of 10 when the old king died, he says, too young to remember much of him whole and well, from before his troubles came on him proper. But I remember the last of it. I remember the keepers coming and going from those rooms with faces like men going to a sick bed they knew wouldn't mend. I remember hearing, of an evening, sounds from that part of the castle that no boy of 10 should hear and not understand, and not being able to ask anyone what they meant, because nobody would answer a question like that put by a child. He turns his cup slowly in his crooked hands. I don't know if it was cruelty, girl, any more than your Susan Yarrow does. I know it was sorrow. I know the whole castle held its breath around those rooms for years, the way a house holds its breath around any sick room, only this sick room went on for the better part of a decade, and everyone in it aged 10 years for everyone that passed. Whatever they did in that room, they did it because they did not know what else there was to do, and because a king losing his mind entire in front of the whole world was a thing this country had never had to reckon with before. Not truly. Not since long before living memory. They were making it up as they went, same as anyone facing a grief that big generally has to. And now they've painted over the door? And now they've painted over the door, Ezra agrees. And in another 60 years, when I'm long in the ground and you're an old woman same's I am now, telling some new girl about it over a jug of beer at this same gate, most like even the painting over will be forgotten, and there'll be nothing left of that room at all but whatever we choose to carry forward in our own heads. That's all history ever really is in the end, not the stone. The stone doesn't care what happened inside it. History's what the people who were there choose to remember and choose to pass on, or choose to let die with them instead. He looks at you then steadily, the way he looked at you 4.5 years before, sizing up a new girl too small for 14. Which are you going to do, Matty Kello? Let it die with you or carry it forward? You do not answer him directly that evening, but the answer, in truth, has already been forming in you for a year, since the moment you stood in that service doorway watching 18 visitors from Bristol walk past a story they would never know they had walked past. You are going to carry it. Not loudly. You have no wish to be dismissed from a place and a wage that your father and what remains of your family genuinely need, but quietly, the way Ezra himself has carried it for 60 years, waiting for the right ears, the right evening, the right jug of beer between two people who understand that some stories are not meant to be shouted from the terrace to a crowd of Sunday visitors, but are not meant to vanish entirely either. The castle goes on, as castles do, indifferent in its stone to whatever griefs and scandals and small private sorrows accumulate inside it, year upon year, king upon queen upon king. The building work continues under the prince's restless direction well into the following year, and the year after that, kitchens modernised, drains relaid, the old squalor of the Georgian household steadily, expensively erased in favour of something cleaner, more efficient, more suited to the age. And alongside the building work, something else begins in that same period that you only half understand at the time, but that will, looking back on it years later, seem to you the clearest possible answer to everything the sealed room ever taught you. In the October of 1845, word comes below stairs that the Queen and Prince have purchased an estate on an island off the southern coast, a place called Osborne, where a new house is to be built, private, modern, entirely their own, away from the crowds on the terrace and the tourists on the public route, and the 800 years of accumulated ceremony and obligation that Windsor Castle can never quite set down. You hear the news from Susan in the linen room, folding pillowcases with the automatic efficiency of 5 years' practice. Why would they want a whole new house, you ask, when they've got this one? Susan considers the question longer than you expect. Because this one isn't theirs. Not really, she says finally. Not the way a house belongs to an ordinary family. This one belongs to the country, to history, to every visitor who buys a shilling ticket and every gawper on the terrace of a Sunday evening. They live here, but they don't get to be private here. Not truly, not ever, not even behind their own locked doors. Because sooner or later, girl, every locked door in this castle gets opened by somebody. A workman, a housemaid, a curious new king 100 years from now, wondering what's behind the panelling. Nothing stays hidden here forever. I expect they've finally worked that out for themselves and decided they'd like one house, at least, where that isn't true. You think of the chair and the bars and the scratches in the plaster, painted over now, but never, you suspect, entirely gone. Not so long as stone remembers the shape of what pressed against it. You think of 18 visitors from Bristol walking past a doorway that held, within living memory, a king's whole ruined decade, and never knowing it. You think of the terrace, and the crowd's small comfort in watching a queen try to look ordinary for an hour of a Sunday evening, and the enormous unspoken cost, on both sides of that fragile arrangement, of keeping the performance running. Windsor Castle, you understand now, more clearly than Susan has perhaps even meant to teach you, is not simply a house, grand or otherwise. It is a machine for the manufacture of a particular kind of forgetting, built stone by stone across 8 centuries, staffed by hundreds of hands like your own, and its true purpose, underneath the gilt and the ceremony and the shilling tickets, has never really been to remember the kings and queens who live there. It has been, all along, to decide, carefully, deliberately, generation after generation, which parts of them the world is permitted to see, and which parts get quietly carried out under a dust sheet, never to be spoken of on any public route again. You think about that machine again the following summer, standing once more on the terrace of a warm Sunday evening, watching the Queen and Prince walk their measured circuit, while a new crowd, none of whom were present the year the tassel swayed or the year the door came open, presses gently against the same invisible line their parents and grandparents pressed against before them. A little girl near the front, no older than 5, is lifted onto her father's shoulders for a better view, and shrieks with a delight so unguarded, so entirely without calculation, that half the crowd around her turns to smile at the sound, before turning back to watch the royal couple pass. You watch the girl instead, for a moment, rather than the Queen, and think that this too is part of what the castle manufactures, alongside its careful forgetting, not only the swallowing of old griefs, but the steady, renewable production of small, unguarded joys like this one, offered up fresh to a new crowd every single fine Sunday of every single year, regardless of whatever old sorrow happens, at that same hour, to be resting quietly behind a freshly painted door not 400 yards away. The years keep moving after that, the way years do. You stay at Windsor a good while longer, long enough to see the Prince of Wales grow from a temperamental toddler into a solemn small boy walked stiffly through the gardens by tutors, long enough to see 2 more royal children born and celebrated with their own bonfires on the hillsides, long enough to be trusted eventually with rooms further up the household ladder than the great blacking and drugget rolling of your first winter. You never do tell anyone else what you saw that October afternoon, beyond the one conversation with Ezra at the gatehouse, not Dinah, who marries a footman from another household 2 years later and moves away entirely. Not your father, who dies peacefully enough in his own bed above the timber yard when you're 21, never once having asked you in all those years what exactly went on behind the walls you disappeared into every morning before dawn, but you keep it. That is the promise you make to Ezra and to yourself on that autumn evening at the gatehouse, and it is a promise you find, to your own mild surprise, that you do not particularly want to break, even years later, even long after there is any real danger in the telling. Some things, you come to believe, are not made lighter by being shouted into the world. They're made lighter, if they can be made lighter at all, by being carried carefully, by someone willing to hold their weight, and passed on, when the moment is right, to exactly one more pair of hands prepared to go on carrying them in turn. Ezra dies in the spring of 1847, quietly, in his sleep, in the small pensioner's room near the gatehouse where he has lived out his last years, and you are one of perhaps a dozen people from the household who attend his burial in the town churchyard, standing at the graveside in a borrowed black shawl, while the vicar says words that seem, to your ear, far too small for a man who carried 60 years of a castle's secrets in his own 2 hands, and chose, at the end, to hand at least one of them safely on rather than let it go down into the ground with him. You think, watching the sexton's spade turn the first heavy clods of earth back over the grave, that this is what it means, in the end, to be trusted with a story. Not applause, not recognition, nothing so grand as either, but simply the quiet responsibility of being the next pair of hands, and knowing that someday, if you do the thing properly, there will need to be a pair of hands after your own as well. That pair of hands arrives, as such things generally do without any fanfare at all, in the January of 1849, in the shape of a new under-housemaid named Ruth, 12 years old and shaking with cold and fright in exactly the spot by the kitchen court door where you yourself once stood 8 years before, clutching a canvas bag she is plainly terrified to set down for even a moment. You, 22 now, entrusted these past 2 years with the training of new girls, are the ones sent to meet her. You're small for 12, you say, and here with a small private jolt. Mrs. Prewitt's own words coming out of your own mouth, 8 years on, as naturally as breathing. I'm big enough to work, Ma'am, Ruth says, chin lifting, and you have to look away for a moment and press your lips together hard, because the girl's voice is shaking even as her chin comes up, and it is, in every particular that matters, exactly your own voice, on exactly that first freezing morning, and something in your chest turns over slowly at the sound of it. You take Ruth through the grates that first week, the same as you were taken through them. Show her how to work the blacking to a shine that stops looking wet and starts looking like something that was always black. Watch her arm ache and her knuckles scrape and her eyes water from the turpentine smell in an unheated room, and say nothing of any of it beyond the practical instruction the moment requires, because that too is part of what you learned from Susan Yarrow in those first months. That sympathy, however genuinely felt, does not black an iron surface any faster, and a girl learns her trade better from a steady hand than a soft one. But on an evening some months later, with Ruth settled enough into the household's rhythms to be trusted with a walk down to the gatehouse, and back on an errand that requires no urgency at all, you find yourself, almost without deciding to, telling her about old Ezra, who died before she ever set foot in the castle, and whom she will therefore never meet, and about the jug of small beer, and about a man who carried 60 years of this place inside him, and chose, near the end of his life, to to hand at least a little of that weight onto someone he judged steady enough to carry it. You do not tell her about the room. Not yet. Ruth is 12, and there is time yet to judge whether she is the kind of girl who can hold a heavy thing quietly, the way Susan judged it of you, the way Ezra judged it in his turn, one careful test at a time across a slow unfolding handful of years. But you plant the seed all the same, the way a seed was once planted in you, on a bitter February afternoon with a jug of small beer between two people who had, as yet, no particular reason to trust one another beyond an old man's instinct and a girl's willingness to listen. That is how it goes on, you think, watching Ruth walk ahead of you back up the hill toward the castle gate, her small shape dark against the last of the evening light. Not in grand pronouncements, not in confessions shouted from the terrace to a crowd of Sunday visitors. In small, unhurried transfers, one careful hand to the next, across however many decades the castle itself goes on standing, long after every person currently living within its walls has gone the way of old Ezra, and, in the fullness of time, the way you yourself will eventually go too. It is late now, later than you meant to sit thinking about any of this, and the attic room under the eaves has gone dark and quiet around you, the way it does every night at this hour. The castle beneath you settling into the particular hush that falls over a great house once the last candle on the visitor's route has been snuffed and the last hearth banked for the night. Somewhere below, a night watchman's slow footsteps cross a stone passage and fade. Somewhere further off, past the round tower, past the long walk stretching south into darkness, an owl calls once from the trees along the river and is not answered. You are tired now too, the way a day of standing and carrying and small careful attention leaves a person tired. A good clean tiredness that settles into the shoulders and asks gently to be allowed to rest. Let it settle. Let the ache in your hands ease into the mattress beneath you, the way your ache eases, night after night, into the thin straw pallet under the eaves. Let the last of the day's noise, the bells, the crowd on the terrace, the scrape of a door forced open after decades of silence, fade the way all noise fades eventually into the deeper quiet underneath it. Feel the weight of your own body sinking into whatever is holding it now, the small, steady give of a mattress taking your shape the way the straw pallet takes yours, night after night, year after year, until the shape of your own tiredness is as familiar to that narrow bed as the shape of your own hand. Feel your hands, wherever they are resting, finally allowed to stop. No brush to grip, no bucket to haul, no curtain to still, no fresh-cut holly scratching at the wrists. Just stillness. Just the small, ordinary miracle of a body with nothing further required of it tonight. Somewhere far off, if you listen, there is a bell. Not an alarm, not a summons. Just an old bell in an old tower, marking an hour that has already passed, that nobody now needs to answer to. Let it toll once, and fade, and be done. Centuries will pass. The castle you polished and swept and carried coal through will change beyond anything you or Ezra or Susan Yarrow could have pictured on that autumn afternoon in 1844. New kings will come and go through those same gilded rooms. New crowds will gather on new terraces, in new centuries, hoping for the same small comfort the woman in the outdated bonnet felt, watching a queen try for one Sunday evening to look ordinary. New doors will be sealed and in their turn forced open, and in their turn sealed again, because that is what castles do, generation after generation, and it is what people do too, in their smaller way, behind the doors of their own ordinary houses, deciding quietly, without ever quite discussing it aloud, which rooms get shown to visitors and which rooms get painted shut. But some things do not change, however many centuries pass over them. The comfort of a warm bed at the end of a hard day does not change. The particular peace of having carried something difficult honestly, without letting it curdle into either silence or spectacle, does not change. And the oldest comfort of all, the one you reach for now as your eyes finally close in the dark under the eaves, does not change either. The simple animal relief of a body finally allowed to stop, to let the ache go, to let the mind's long day of carrying set its burden down at last and drift. Let it come. Let sleep take you the way it took you in your attic room above the North Range, 200 years and more ago, the bells of the castle falling silent one by one below you. Let the noise of the day fade. Let the questions you cannot answer tonight wait quietly for tomorrow, the way they always do, the way they always have. Let your thoughts slow and soften and finally stop. You have earned this rest. Take it. Good night.